Our world is full of mysteries and riddles that sometimes hide right beside us. Today, we will tell you a story about how ordinary life events can turn into a real nightmare for some people. Do vows and promises truly have power? How meaningful are the oaths taken by newlyweds or doctors? This story vividly demonstrates that for certain individuals, such words mean nothing, and the trust of others can be destroyed by fatal acts and murders. In early 1998, Major Jean-Paul Zawatski, the chief flight engineer of military aviation, returned from a long assignment in Gabon, where he actively participated in military operations. Finally, after many months of separation, he was able to see his wife Nicole and their 10-year-old daughter. The family lived in the small town of Souche in the Loire department, near the military base where Jean-Paul served. He had 3 weeks of rest ahead of him to regain his strength before returning to duty. However, shortly after his arrival, the health of the military engineer began to deteriorate rapidly. He developed fatigue and cough. When the first symptoms of illness appeared, his wife bought cold medicine recommended by their family doctor, Michel Piron. He assumed that the man's body was simply adapting after the hot and dry climate of Africa. However, the situation did not improve. Within a month, Jean-Paul's eyes turned red, he began vomiting, and diarrhea appeared. In this condition, the major could not return to service, so he was forced to ask for an extension of his leave. On February 14, the man's health worsened again, and his wife once more called the family doctor to their home. Jean-Paul was asked to take tests and was prescribed new medications. Although blood tests did not reveal anything serious, the man's condition was extremely grave. More than a month had passed since his return from Africa, but the officer's health continued to deteriorate rapidly. The once strong and athletic man could barely stand on his feet and was short of breath from the slightest physical exertion. The family doctor was struck by the changes that had occurred in his patient. The man who had always been active in sports now barely moved around the house, hunched over and hiding his reddened eyes behind dark glasses. The last visit to the doctor took place on March 8. Michel Piron concluded that the deterioration of Jean-Paul's health was caused by overwork and stress after participating in the military mission. In his opinion, the body should recover over time, and the man would be able to return to his normal life. To speed up the recovery, the doctor insisted on extending the leave and taking the prescribed medications. Jean-Paul followed the advice, but it was too late. On March 11, Nicole Zawatski turned to her mother-in-law with the tragic news that her husband had suddenly died. Jean-Paul, the son of Polish immigrants, had dreamed of the sky since childhood. He managed to fulfill his dream by joining the military service. At the age of 21, he met Nicole in a nightclub, and feelings immediately flared up between them. Their relationship had lasted for 18 years, and the couple was raising a 10-year-old daughter. It was unclear how a 39-year-old soldier in the prime of his life could deteriorate so quickly without apparent reasons. And 2 months after returning from another business trip, he suddenly passed away. Initially, the attending physician claimed that the cause of the sharp deterioration in health could be stress and physical exertion experienced by the major during the mission in Africa. It was known that during this period, he also trained intensively. It was assumed that Jean-Paul died as a result of overexertion and a subsequent heart attack. But there was every reason to believe that the doctor was unable to establish the true reasons for the deterioration of the soldier's condition and death. The death certificate stated that Jean-Paul died of natural causes. On March 16, the serviceman's body was buried. The widow, struck by the grief of loss, turned to the military command with a request for the pilot friends to deliver the body of her beloved husband to the farewell ceremony, which was to take place in his native region of Châteauneuf-sur-Cher. A huge crowd of relatives, friends, and military colleagues with whom Major Zawatski had served shoulder to shoulder gathered to pay their respects to the deceased. They were all united not only by friendly relations with Jean-Paul but also by surprise that such a healthy and strong person could suddenly die like that. The man had always been in excellent physical shape and had never had any health problems before. For no apparent reason, he simply went on vacation in a great mood, completely healthy, and here is such a tragic end that shocked all his loved ones. When relatives and fellow servicemen recovered from the bitterness of loss, everyone who knew the Major began to be tormented by the question, what really happened? Jean-Paul was known as a true professional and a reliable comrade. He had an impeccable reputation at the military base among his colleagues and superiors. The man was known for his dedication to sports, which had made him a real muscle machine. Jean-Paul had always been noted for his robust health. Interestingly, just a few weeks before leaving for the mission in Gabon, he successfully passed an in-depth medical examination with all the necessary tests. And immediately before returning home, his well-being did not raise any doubts in anyone. What could have happened to the brave officer after returning to his homeland? The military leadership also became interested in this issue. Having familiarized themselves with the case of Major Zawatski's death, the command immediately doubted the competence of his doctor. In fact, he was unable to clearly establish the cause of death and did not make a diagnosis, although he referred to some kind of illness. Against the background of other facts, this looked extremely suspicious. Serious questions arose about Dr. Michel Piron. The 49-year-old doctor was considered a fairly experienced specialist and had been in private practice for over 20 years. For many years, he was a local Esculapius devoted to his work, who practically lived at work, tirelessly caring for his patients. The doctor had a crystal-clear reputation. He was considered an excellent psychologist who understood people at a glance. But over the past year, the doctor had clearly lost ground, and it seemed that something was weighing on him and distracting him. The man had befriended the Zawatski family, and it appeared that he was paying much more attention to them than to his other clients. It was found out that Michel Piron regularly visited Nicole, although the woman was completely healthy. Rumors spread throughout the small town where the couple lived. Many neighbors of the family repeatedly noticed the doctor's car near the Zawatski house when the soldier was not at home. He often came with flowers and other gifts, which led to thoughts about an extramarital affair with Nicole. After these details became known, public attention focused on the behavior of the widow. Many people noted that she behaved strangely during the funeral ceremony and in the days following her husband's death. It might seem that the tragedy did not particularly affect her. Shortly after Jean-Paul's death, his wife became the owner of an expensive BMW car. This also caused surprise, because the family already had an ordinary car that Nicole could freely use, and they hardly had the money for such a purchase. Observers noted that by her behavior, the woman did not at all resemble a grief-stricken widow. Suspicions gradually began to arise that the Major's death might not have been accidental and that his own wife was somehow involved in it. The mechanics at the air base and everyone who worked closely with Jean-Paul also actively discussed his early demise. The military could not believe that he just up and died like that. Rumors spread throughout the base and eventually reached the ears of the colonel, the commander of the air base. He also noticed that the Major was completely healthy and was being treated by an experienced doctor, so his death seemed not only strange but also extremely suspicious. And when information reached him that the family doctor might be Madame Zawatski's lover, the suspicions only intensified. Eventually, the colonel made the decision to turn to law enforcement. 2 months after Jean-Paul's death, on May 14, 1998, he summoned the gendarmes and told them about his suspicions. The commander was most interested in the mysterious illness, which for unknown reasons could not be properly diagnosed by a doctor with more than 20 years of experience, who was also the widow's lover. The colonel stated that he was extremely concerned about the situation and feared a possible threat to his other subordinates. He did not make direct accusations and did not rush to call Jean-Paul's death a murder, but he expressed serious doubts about what had happened. At the very least, the commander wanted to make sure that the insidious disease would not take anyone else. The gendarmes themselves became interested in Nicole's behavior, as well as the conclusions of the doctor who, as it turned out, was her lover. It was decided to start an investigation. At that time, there were no strong grounds for suspicion yet. Of course, The woman had drastically changed her life immediately after her husband's death. Undoubtedly, her connection with Dr. Michel continued, but this fact alone was not enough to consider her a murderer. However, the purchase of almost the most expensive car, when the widow was not working anywhere, could be considered a financial motive. Apparently, she spent her husband's money on it. Nicole clearly could not afford such a purchase with her own funds, which she virtually did not have. It was established that Jean-Paul had 2 insurance policies, with a total payout exceeding 1 million francs. Nicole applied for this money immediately after her husband's funeral and received it. Shortly after that, she began to spend actively. She bought a car, furniture, and started a large-scale renovation of the house. When examining the family's financial condition, the police noticed large debts that had accumulated. Nicole had not paid them off, and by the time the investigation began, only a small fraction of the insurance payout remained. There was no longer enough money to pay off overdue bills. Jean-Paul did not know about the debts, because his wife, who was not working anywhere and lived solely on her husband's earnings, handled all the financial issues in the family. Of course, the accumulated debts indicated that Nicole was managing the soldiers' considerable income unwisely. Obviously, she was spending money somewhere but hiding it. This fact allowed confirming the investigators' suspicions. Now the woman had a motive. It was quite possible that her husband's death allowed her to avoid exposure of financial fraud and improve her material situation. Of course, all these guesses had yet to be proven or disproven during the investigation. The gendarmes managed to gain access to Nicole's mobile phone and found out that on the night of March 10th to 11th, a whole series of calls took place between her and the doctor. Their communication lasted until the very hour of Jean-Paul's death, which was recorded at 1500 hours on March 11, 1998. The medic indicated natural causes of death, mentioned some kind of illness, but did not bother to describe the details in detail. It seemed as if he was deliberately hiding something. Now the law enforcement officers had 2 possible lines of work. The gendarmes could simply look for the causes of death, but this gave relatively little room for action within the framework of a criminal investigation. Or this death could be treated as murder, then the police would have more authority. It was the second option that the prosecutor chose, which made it possible to obtain the right to exhume the body, as well as the corresponding warrants. The problem was that due to the testimony of the deceased's attending physician, an autopsy by a forensic expert was avoided. Considering that Jean-Paul had been in the ground for over 2 months, action had to be taken quickly. The investigators put forward the assumption that poisoning was used as a method of murder. On June 2, 1998, Jean-Paul's remains were exhumed. Unexpectedly, at the same time, the widow appeared at the cemetery, allegedly wanting to pray at the grave of her deceased husband. Her presence seemed strange, because the woman had never shown much grief over the loss before. But despite this, the gendarmes did their job. At this point, the detectives again drew attention to Nicole's suspicious behavior. She did not shed tears and seemed completely indifferent. Instead, she felt nauseous when Jean-Paul's body was pulled out of the ground. This could be a reaction to stress, because now she realized that her insidious plans might be exposed. The woman was clearly worried that she would have to answer for what she had done. Immediately after the exhumation, 40-year-old Nicole was arrested on suspicion of murder. She was put in a patrol car and taken away from the cemetery. The widow understood what was going on, so she could take countermeasures to protect herself. That is why it was decided to take her into custody. There was a possibility that she might commit suicide or warn the doctor about the danger. 49-year-old Michel was also detained and taken to the gendarmerie station. The widow and her lover were interrogated separately. At about the same time, Jean-Paul's body ended up on the forensic expert's table, who immediately began the autopsy. The specialist needed time for a thorough analysis of the remains, so he personally asked to keep the suspects in custody for as long as possible. The gendarmes did not rush with tricky questions but simply watched the behavior of the detainees. Nicole seemed to not fully realize what was happening. She spoke at length about the last day of her husband's life, recalled that he woke up and had a good breakfast. According to the woman, he was in a good mood that morning and looked better than in the previous days. Therefore, his sudden death came as a complete surprise to her. And yet Nicole did not see anything strange in this, although she was unable to explain why. By the end of the same day, the autopsy was completed. The forensic expert noted that approximately on the day of death, the major fell into a coma, as evidenced by the post-mortem state of his brain. In view of this fact, the widow's testimony was questionable. If he was really in this state, then he could not have had breakfast and looked good at all. All this contradicted Nicole's words and indicated that the woman was clearly hiding something. Her husband felt very bad throughout the day of March 11th. It is quite possible that the deterioration occurred a day before that. It is unlikely that the wife or the doctor, who often visited the house, could not notice this. But then why did they not make any calls for emergency medical care? Why didn't they take the man to the hospital? The prosecutor's office was convinced that it knew the answer. The couple wanted the soldier to die. This news finally convinced law enforcement that Jean-Paul had died from poisoning committed by his wife, and the doctor had covered for his mistress, or even directed her actions. Now it remained to wait for the results of the toxicological examination, which usually takes a little more time. They showed that for 2 months, Jean-Paul had been poisoned with an explosive mixture of several medicinal drugs, which, when combined, turned out to be extremely toxic. The same cough syrup that his wife had given her husband immediately after his return from Africa, in combination with other medications prescribed by the doctor, had a devastating effect on a healthy body. But this was only one item on the list of poisons found in the victim's body. The police managed to crack the doctor quite quickly. The man agreed to tell everything that had happened. His story began at 22:30 and lasted until 4:30 in the morning the next day. Michel started from the very beginning, from that long-ago meeting with Nicole Zawatski, which changed his life forever. Their relationship began 7 years ago when Michel and Nicole met. At that time, he was visiting his patient who lived near the couple's house. The heroes of this story accidentally crossed glances, and a spark immediately flared up between them. At that time, Nicole's husband was participating in military operations and once again went on a several-month business trip. The lovers began to meet several times a week. Gradually, the doctor became the family therapist and then a trusted person of the Zawatski family. Once at midnight, Nicole called the doctor and asked him to come immediately. When Michel arrived at their house, he saw a woman lying on the floor, curled up in a ball. She was crying and said that she had been physically abused by Jean-Paul. Moreover, the soldier's wife claimed that her husband. According to her, this happened all the time. The woman played on pity. The lover was increasingly worried about his beloved's family life. According to Nicole, the major was cruel to their 10-year-old daughter. The kind-hearted doctor made every effort to support the soldier's wife and the girl, and managed to find a common language with both. The child even drew his portraits, which the mother passed on. Michel gradually gained the favor of his mistress's relatives. He became friends with Aunt Julie, who also often spoke with him on the phone. The woman confirmed the stories about Nicole's ill treatment by her husband. She assured that she was terribly worried about her niece, about her health and even her life. In her opinion, there were good reasons for this. She said that once in a fit of rage, the major broke his wife's arm, and this was far from an isolated case. Eventually, Nicole began to call the family doctor several times a day at any hour. Even if the woman called at 3 in the morning, she could complain for an hour. Each time she had a new story about how Jean-Paul beat her and bullied the child. It seems that she began to exhaust her lover. There could be 10 to 30 calls per night. It was clear that the doctor, who worked without days off, needed a full rest. Calls every 10 to 15 minutes were exhausting. Michel did not get enough sleep and walked around tired. Only on the day of the major's death, 6 outgoing calls from the doctor to Nicole were recorded, and she called him more than 300 times. This relationship had so exhausted Michel that many patients did not recognize him. The doctor was physically and emotionally drained. He was very worried about Nicole and her daughter, horrified at the thought that something might happen to them. Patients noticed that he was almost not interested in their problems and fell asleep on the go. The man himself admitted that he had become too absorbed in the troubles of the Zawatski family. In the end, over the 7 years of this extramarital affair, Nicole managed to completely convince her lover that Jean-Paul was a cruel tyrant. The woman so engrossed Michel's every thought that he even left his wife and 3 children for her. Now the only obstacle on the path to their boundless love was the soldier. Shortly before the tragedy, Nicole told Michel that she had decided to file a report on domestic violence and begin the divorce process. But, according to her, the bureaucratic red tape greatly slowed down the case. She begged him to save her and her daughter from her aunt. All 3 of them wrote notes to the doctor asking for help. Gradually, Michel came to the only possible conclusion, in his opinion, murder. Having become accustomed to this idea, he suggested making a lethal injection of a substance that, in combination with others, is a powerful poison capable of causing almost instant death in a large dose. But it would be too obvious, so the conspirators decided to act more carefully. Luckily for the poisoner and her accomplice, after returning from Africa, Jean-Paul developed a cough. That's when they added the first drops of poison. The doctor developed a mixture that was supposed to have a slow and exhausting effect on the body, and at the right moment, a fatal injection was planned. The plan was put into action on February 11th, when after another dose of medication, Jean-Paul lost consciousness and the opportune moment arrived. But the doctor admitted that he could not kill the man with this injection, he lacked the courage. On February 14th, Nicole tried to poison Jean-Paul with another substance. It caused nausea, diarrhea, and reddening of the eyes. The doctor arrived on call and gave an injection that was supposed to alleviate the symptoms. However, the injection contained a small dose of a lethal substance. Fortunately, it was not enough. The soldier's body, strong and healthy, resisted. Then Michel prescribed pills that were supposed to cause heart problems. Under their influence, Jean-Paul did indeed begin to experience severe pain and asked for sick leave. However, he was still alive and fighting the poison. Both conspirators watched the victim's condition. Another failure required improvisation. The doctor allegedly prescribed magnesium but substituted it with 2 other drugs. It was a new deadly cocktail, but even after that, Jean-Paul continued to live. Nicole called her lover and complained that her husband did not want to die. She gave him an ultimatum: if Jean-Paul did not die, she would take her own life. So on March 4th, Michel Piron once again came to his patient, gave him magnesium, but in reality, it was another potent agent. After a few days under its influence, the major fell into a coma. On March 11th, the doctor returned to the house to give an injection that would make the coma irreversible. Having administered the drug, he took his beloved and her daughter and took them to his home for lunch. Nicole returned around 1400 hours and found her husband dead. She cleaned up the house, got rid of all the incriminating items, and called the police. As soon as this story ended, the doctor was charged with murder. He left, saying that his strong feelings for this woman had completely devastated him. Michel had become so entangled in her lies that he had stopped distinguishing between good and evil. The doctor burst into tears. But were those tears of repentance or self-pity of a caught criminal? Only Nicole could answer these questions. When the Black Widow was told that the doctor had confessed to the murder, the woman also made a counter-confession. She knew about his intentions. Nicole insisted that it was the doctor who, out of jealousy, decided to deal with her husband. She was not aware of his plans and sincerely believed that Michel was trying to cure Jean-Paul. Nicole allegedly learned about the murder only at lunch on March 11th, when she and her daughter came to the doctor's house. According to the woman, at that lunch, Michel gave her detailed instructions on how to behave if they were detained. She had no choice but to follow his plan. To prove or disprove this testimony, more information was needed. Perhaps the murder was conceived and carried out by the doctor himself, or maybe the woman was his accomplice for several months. In search of new data, the gendarmes searched the new car that Nicole had purchased after her husband's death. Numerous messages from banks and bailiffs were found in it. The family's financial situation turned out to be even worse than previously thought. Nicole was facing prosecution for debts. So the woman had a strong motive for murder. Further searches were carried out at the doctor's house. There they managed to find drawings that the major's daughter had allegedly sent. Criminologists doubted that these small notes and images were really made by a child. A graphologist and a psychologist were involved in the investigation and conducted an examination. With Nicole's participation, tests were carried out, the results of which proved with 100% certainty that it was she who wrote these notes, trying to forge her daughter's handwriting. It also turned out that all this time, Michel was communicating not with Aunt Julie, who did not really exist, but with Nicole herself. She simply changed her voice during phone conversations. After several years of such intense brainwashing, Michel completely lost his head because of the lies. The scale of Nicole's deception was staggering. She managed to touch the doctor with stories about how she lost her entire family due to various accidents and illnesses. Although in fact, everyone was alive. Then she played on pity with stories about beatings by her husband. For her part, she lied to Jean-Paul for years, in particular that she worked in a nursing home. But in reality, this black widow did not work anywhere and simply spent all the money that the soldier earned while constantly on business trips. Naturally, against this background, the family's financial situation deteriorated significantly. But until the last moment, Nicole managed to hide it from her husband. Unfortunately, when the threat of a lawsuit arose, Nicole realized that exposure could not be avoided. Then she could not think of anything better than to kill Jean-Paul and receive compensation for his life. Analyzing the personality of the probable criminal, psychiatrists discovered a pathological liar with very complex behavior. She was a born manipulator and fully demonstrated her skills using the doctor as an example. She managed to convince her lover that Jean-Paul was really dangerous and cruel. Although everyone who knew the soldier well denied any such assumptions. No one had ever seen bruises on the widow's body. In a conversation with the deceased's daughter, it was found out that Jean-Paul had never laid a finger on either Nicole or the girl. She described her father as a kind and loving family man. All the woman's stories turned out to be lies. She never went to the police and did not try to file for divorce. Although Michel was a murderer, at the same time he became a victim of a dangerous criminal who not only manipulated him and led him to crime but also derived great pleasure from it. However, the psychiatric examination did not reveal any abnormalities, so the woman had to stand trial and answer for her crimes to the fullest extent of the law. To unravel this whole tangle of lies, it took almost 2 years of investigation, during which the accused were held in custody without the right to bail. Finally, in June 2001, the suspects appeared before the jury. Even during the sessions, it was noticeable that Nicole continued to dominate the doctor. She was restrained and cold. She insisted on her innocence, claiming that the idea of poisoning belonged exclusively to Michel. Fortunately, the criminal's version changed once again, and the prosecutor pointed this out, quite convincingly exposing the lie. But even after that, the Black Widow continued to lie. In fact, it only worsened her position. The doctor behaved completely differently. Many witnesses vied with each other to praise him as a specialist and a person. However, this did not negate the fact that it was he who played a significant role in the murder. When the jurors returned after deliberating on the sentences, they found both defendants guilty. Nicole Zawatski received 25 years in prison, and her lover got 20 years. The woman was furious with the court's decision. Almost immediately after that, the Black Widow decided to appeal the verdict. Since she had killed Jean-Paul together with Michel, he also faced a retrial. The new trial took place in March 2002 and lasted 4 days. As a result, Nicole's prison term was increased to 28 years. Michel's punishment was left unchanged. Both are still behind bars. Nicole once again managed to set up the majority of those around her in a way that was convenient for her. Therefore, in prison, the criminal enjoys comprehensive support. I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Until next time, friends.